I'm Leslie Espiricueta, and I am a law student at St. Mary's University School of Law. I am also a member of the National Advisory Committee at Equal Justice Works, a diverse group of law students and law school professionals who serve as Equal Justice Works ambassadors within the law school and legal services communities. We are here for another installment of the My Impact Alumni Series, this time with Gabriella Larios, a 2020 Equal Justice Works Fellow. We're here today to talk about how an Equal Justice Works Fellowship launched Gabriella's career and to hopefully inspire law students to follow their passion for public service and equal justice. Thank you, Gabriella, for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thanks, Leslie. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited too. So I have a few questions for you. The first one is basically just what initially drew you to your specific issue area?
So my project engaged in advocacy, public education, outreach, and litigation to challenge the use of religion to discriminate against people seeking reproductive health care and LGBTQ New Yorkers. My host organization is the New York Civil Liberties Union, or was the New York Civil Liberties Union, and I'm currently on staff there. And we are the New York State affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union. So my work throughout my fellowship was specifically in New York State. And as a queer person, I grew up going to Catholic school. I was raised religious my whole life, and I went to an all-girl Catholic school, which, as a queer person, presented a level of challenges for me. And at my school, we had a lot of policies that restricted same-sex attraction or affection, and that deeply affected my sense of self and my understanding of my own identity. So, for example, for senior prom, you had the choice of either going to prom with a date who was a man, or you couldn't go to prom alone. You couldn't go to prom at all. You couldn't go to prom single. So what was that telling you? You either had to be in a same-sex relationship or miss out on this critical, life-changing opportunity that is supposed to be prom. So growing up in a religious community where I didn't feel like my identity was accepted really paved the way for me wanting to work in LGBTQ rights law because I have a very personal stake in it. And as somebody who has the capacity to get pregnant, I was simultaneously really interested in reproductive rights and reproductive justice more broadly, thinking about how in the future I'm going to shape my own family in a way that may or may not be sanctioned by the state. So both of these issues, reproductive rights and justice and LGBTQ rights, were really deeply intertwined for me as I was going through law school and thinking about what kind of lawyer I wanted to be. Both of these issue areas really stem from an attack on bodily autonomy and from being able to shape your own life in whatever way you see fit. So it felt like the perfect fit for me to engage in this project where I'm trying to challenge the use of that religion to discriminate and increase access to healthcare and also public life for people with reproductive capacity and for LGBTQ people. My project was pitched back in 2019, which is a time after the Supreme Court's decision in Masterpiece Cake Shop, where a baker had denied a same-sex couple the right to buy a wedding cake at the bakery. And it was also coming at the time, my conception of this project was also coming at a time when the federal courts were getting increasingly conservative. Over the past decade, we've seen US courts be flooded with cases brought by institutions who are claiming a right to religious freedom that entitles them to refuse to comply with anti-discrimination laws. At the same time, we're also seeing a rise in religious hospitals all across the country. So religious hospitals are often subject to these things called ethical and religious directives, which restrict the number of, or the types of care that can be provided in any given hospital. So this is anything from miscarriage management to abortion, treatment of ectopic pregnancies, gender-affirming care, and life care, a whole range of really essential healthcare services. So we've seen an increase in hospital mergers where one larger religious hospital system sort of absorbs or Pac-Man's up a smaller community hospital that it usually doesn't have these restrictions, which means that in certain places, entire communities are left without access to this care. If that secular community hospital was the only one that was around, and now it is subject to these directives, people in that community can't access healthcare. So all of that, the political and cultural climate at the time that I was pitching this project, as well as my own lived experiences, really drew me to this particular issue area. And working at the ACLU, we're an organization that advocates for LGBT rights and reproductive rights. And we're also an organization that advocates for religious liberty and freedom. So it felt like the perfect organization to do this work and really take a nuanced approach to it. I feel like in some ways really lucky and grateful that I started working on this issue area when I did in 2020, especially seeing that since my fellowship, started, abortion access has been decimated across the country following the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs last summer when Roe v. Wade was overturned. And just this summer, a couple months ago, in 303 Creative v. Lennis, the Supreme Court, for the first time in its history, granted a business open to the public a constitutional right to refuse to serve members of a protected class. So all of these issues feel really pressing, really timely right now, and I feel lucky to be doing this work at this time.
Wow, it sounds like your lived experiences really drove you to that interest area, and then the political climate really made your work extra important and crucial at that time point. So I just want to know, what did you learn throughout the course of your fellowship, if you had to highlight a few things?
I feel like I learned so much about, being a lawyer, being a person, being an advocate. Like I mentioned, my project spanned the course of a whole bunch of different strategies, so litigation, policy advocacy, community engagement. And I feel like I learned something different engaging in each of those modes. So a big aspect of my fellowship project was supporting on-the-ground efforts to preserve comprehensive access to healthcare in a proposed merger between a secular community hospital and a religious healthcare system in Schenectady, New York. And I got to collaborate with a community coalition to educate the public and really elevate the impact of the religious directives on reproductive health care and on LGBTQ inclusive care. I feel like that was really important for me to be able to see how a lot of people don't know about what is going on at their local hospital and don't know until it's too late, until they are there in an emergency situation, that they're not going to get the full scope of evidence-backed medical care. It was really important for me to work with this community coalition in Schenectady because we were able to leverage the expertise of the ACLU and our past experience working in hospital mergers and with religious directives to help empower the community to push back against what was supposed to be a really fast-moving merger and transaction. So because of the community education, the rallies, the public comments, everything we did, instead of moving full steam ahead to fully merge the two hospitals, the hospitals actually engaged in this sort of side process where it was an interim agreement instead of a full merger. So right now we are still working on this same merger and still pushing back and trying to identify ways to preserve care. Because once a deal like that goes through, it's sometimes impossible to undo it. So it was really important to have sustained advocacy and engagement over the course of now 3 years. I also gained a ton of litigation skills. So for example, in numerous different courts. So for example, I co-authored a whole bunch of amicus briefs that were all centered on challenging the use of religion to discriminate in New York State Court, in district courts, and in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. And with amicus briefs, sometimes you are in you're in the interesting position of not being a party to the case, but really bringing in an important aspect that might be lost in the litigation. So for example, in a case where religious employers are challenging a law that protects employees' reproductive health decision-making, we were able to come in as amici and talk about the real life impacts on employees who are discriminated against because they've had an abortion or because they've had IVF treatment. And that storytelling aspect was really central to all of the work as a fellow. I also gained, leadership and case management and other litigation skills throughout my time working on a range of different issue areas related to LGBT rights and reproductive rights. So for example, in the New York State Division of Human Rights, I got to lead our work filing a complaint on behalf of a Latinx mother who was non-consensually drug tested when she gave birth at a private hospital in New York State. I am also on the litigation teams for several other cases, including one on behalf of a Black trans woman in Broome County who was discriminated against and abused and denied medical care while she was incarcerated at the Broome County Jail. So challenging the way that trans and non-binary people are discriminated against by government actors was also a really integral piece of my fellowship project. And finally, I got to be on a different side of things, engaging in policy advocacy that was directly related to my fellowship project as well. So one of the big efforts that I worked on during my fellowship was our hospital transparency legislation, which is a piece of legislation that aims to provide New Yorkers with tools to determine whether their local hospital does or does not provide the care they need prior to admission, and to identify communities where there are healthcare deserts. That way, advocates and the government have tools to identify and address those healthcare deserts where abortion is provided, where gender-affirming care is provided. So I feel like I got to dig so much deeper on the issues themselves, as well as my own professional development and sense, understanding myself as a lawyer and as an advocate.
Yeah, wow, that was really interesting. It sounds like you're having to fight against these large powers that are systemic in nature, and it just makes the work much harder. But the community aspect sounds very rewarding if you get to collaborate with members that are actually affected by these laws. Could you tell me about a time when you faced a challenge during your work, and how did you navigate that challenge, and what did it teach you?
So I am a 2020 fellow, and as we all know, 2020 is when the pandemic happened and changed the entire world and how it operates. So I think adapting during the pandemic was one of the biggest challenges I faced throughout my fellowship. So originally, when I pitched this project back in 2019, a big part of it was going to be, traveling to different communities and talking to LGBTQ organizations and various reproductive rights direct services providers, and being able to identify gaps in care and being able to do targeted advocacy with those communities. And COVID happened and there was no travel. Nobody was doing anything in person. I couldn't travel across the state to identify these stories. So in the case of the Schenectady merger that I was just talking about, I was able to zero in on that community and really devote so much time and so many resources to advocating with them and to supporting the work that they were doing locally in Schenectady, instead of being spread out across the state as I had originally anticipated. I think throughout the course of the first year and a half, 2 years, most, if not all of the work I did with the coalition in Schenectady was all remote, because we did not feel safe or comfortable going in person. And I was able to build really meaningful relationships with, people on the ground, even though we were talking through a Zoom screen the entire time, by consistently showing up and by continuing to offer myself as a resource, thinking creatively about how we could engage in a meaningful way. And in turn, they were thinking about how they could engage community members in Schenectady and beyond, without necessarily having in-person activities in the way that you were the pandemic. I also didn't get to meet a lot of my co-counsel in person until much later on in my fellowship. My clients, there are many of my clients who I still have not met in person because of the pandemic and because of the geographic, where they're located geographically. So as a junior lawyer, this was my first job out of law school. I had to really think carefully about how to build meaningful relationships with clients in particular who are telling me about the most traumatic experience in their lives via a computer screen. And particularly at the start of the pandemic, that's not something we were used to. It's not something we were used to with our colleagues, with our co-counsel. So I, throughout the course of my fellowship, tried to be very intentional in how I engaged with my clients and with the community members I was collaborating with. I think sometimes being online feels transactional in a way. Sometimes you just sign onto a Zoom and shut it down when you're done talking about the agenda items or whatever it is. But that never felt right or authentic to me. So I feel like I have always tried to get a sense of what is going on in my clients' lives beyond the case that we are working on, beyond the issue we're advocating on. And I think that was really integral to building strong relationships, even as we were going through this global pandemic together. And that's something that I continue to incorporate into every aspect of the work that I do now. Relationships are incredibly important to me. And I think particularly when you are asking people to disclose and relive things that have been traumatic to them, it's really important to model vulnerability as well. So talking about my own experiences as a queer person or as a person of color, it's really important to model that for your clients, your colleagues, your community members that you're working with, if you want to create a space where people can trust you and be vulnerable enough to tell you about, medical trauma and abuse that they have experienced. It's really hard. And that's definitely not something that I could have anticipated when I first thought about this project several years ago.
Yeah, it does sound like that was difficult, especially to develop that connection and trust virtually. That sounds very hard. And that made me wonder, did you have any clients where, for example, access to Wi-Fi in the region was not very prominent? Did that complicate things a bit more? Or was that not the case for you?
For a lot of our clients and the community members that we engaged with, that wasn't a direct issue in the people that I was engaging with directly. But one of the things that we were doing in Schenectady was, developing community surveys and trying to get a sense of how people were feeling about the merger. It had already been denied previously at one of the hospitals that belonged to the larger system. And there we really had to think about, not everybody is going to fill out a Google in the way that you or I might be used to. So in the community outreach aspect of it, the lack of internet, the lack of technology is really important in thinking about how to reach people that aren't 24/7 online and who don't have internet. So that continues to be really important to us, as well as things like language access and other kinds of literacy as well.
So what was the biggest takeaway from your fellowship?
I think the biggest takeaway from my fellowship ties back to what we were just talking about with COVID, and having these changes come when you are least expecting them. Throughout the course of my fellowship, I think the biggest takeaway was you need to adapt to anything and everything that comes your way. So for example, you might be faced with a different president or a different governor or a different state legislature than you originally anticipated when you started thinking about your project or when you were first pitching a piece of legislation or litigation. Sometimes there are internal changes at your organization that happen that you can't predict and need to adapt to. When impact litigation takes years and years and years to move its way through the court, and because of just the amount of time that something like this takes, your client's needs and wants might change over time. And you need to be able to adapt to that, even if your pre-litigation memorandum says, these are our claims, this is how we're going to respond to them in this way, these are our goals with settlement. Your client might, because of where their life is at now, 2 years filed, they might be more interested in settling than they were at the start of the case. They might be more willing to engage in media and other forms of public education than they were at a different point in the case. They might want more privacy than they did originally. So I think over the course of my fellowship, in all of the different work that I did, from the policy advocacy, from the internal professional development to the litigation, I was really having to adapt all the time and having to be comfortable with that. I think as lawyers, sometimes a lot of us are people who want things done a certain way, and we like to be organized and on top of it. And unfortunately, that's not the way that life works. So especially when doing litigation and engaging in policy advocacy, where things like a new Supreme Court justice really affects the outcome of the kinds of issues that you work on. You need to adapt to shift. Instead of filing in federal court, are we going to file in state court to, insulate this from possible Supreme Court review? Do we need to change the strategies we are adopting when pushing this particular piece of legislation? Sometimes those things can work in your favor. Sometimes legislation that you're working on will actually move more quickly because the Supreme Court has done something that removes rights from people, particularly in a state like New York, where we're always trying to make New York more of a beacon for people who have been discriminated against and increase protections here. So that was definitely one of the biggest takeaways from my fellowship. And I think the other thing as an impact litigator that I had to remind myself of and think about throughout the course of my fellowship is that the work you do on a small scale matters. And those one-on-one client interactions are really important. Even just filing the case, even if you don't win, even if it takes 5 years to make its way through the court, even just filing the case and telling your client's story in a complaint, giving your client the opportunity to write an op-ed, to do media, and to tell their story in whatever way they see best fit is really important, even if you ultimately are not successful at the end, because you are, as a lawyer, your main role is to be an advocate for your client. And I think it can get frustrating sometimes to see it's been a year, it's been 2 years, the court is still sitting, waiting on these motions to be decided. But being an advocate for your client really, I think for me, helped me be okay with how long things take. Of course, we want to win. Of course, we want to make, get a court decision that is sweeping and monumental. But also really learned to appreciate these small moments where you're able to support your clients and your colleagues and your coalition partners in these small wins as well.
I think that is so important. I'm glad you brought that up. I think sometimes a lot of public interest-minded lawyers want to make big change and want to make it fast, but those small interactions do matter. And I think it gives back some sense of justice to the communities that are affected by these laws. I know that you mentioned that you're still with the New York Civil Liberties Union. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work since the fellowship?
Well, because impact litigation takes so long, as well as policy advocacy, a lot of my work is still the same as it was during my fellowship. I became a staff attorney in October of last year, so I'm almost coming up on my 1-year anniversary of becoming a staff attorney. So a lot of the cases that I worked on as a fellow are still active. A lot of the community advocacy and policy advocacy that I did during my fellowship are still ongoing. But now that I'm no longer a fellow, my practice has also expanded to be more active on issues. In particular, I feel like I'm really developing an expertise with regards to healthcare in incarceration settings. So I mentioned our case on behalf of Michaela Holland, who was discriminated against in Broome County Jail. She was denied antidepressants, gender affirming care, a whole bunch of other things. That case gave me a lot of insight into healthcare in jails. At the same time, I'm now also on one of the cases, MC v. Jefferson County, which is a class action on behalf of people in the Jefferson County Jail who were denied medication for their opioid use disorder, and they were subject to withdrawals and a whole host of other health outcomes because of it. So I feel like I'm zeroing in some ways on that, on healthcare and incarceration settings, and continue to think about and push different ways to get more and better access in jails and prisons across New York State. NICLU is also an organization that does a ton of transparency work, so around the police in particular. So I am getting to do more and potentially litigating public records requests that seek to shed light on police interactions and other things the government has done. And I continue to be really involved in our LGBTQ and reproductive rights work. So now, as a staff attorney, I get to lead our gender and sexuality work group, which our departments come together and discuss issues related to LGBTQ rights, reproductive rights, gender justice, all of those things. And that's really important to me, being at an organization that takes an integrated advocacy model. So we have a department that has organizers, our policy department, we have an education policy center that has advocates in it. So that's really important for me to see how I can work with other departments at my organization and how we can take a multifaceted, multi-pronged approach to any issue area. So I'm excited to keep exploring different aspects of civil rights and civil liberties issues while maintaining this focus on LGBTQ rights and reproductive rights. I think as the Supreme Court continues to make decisions like Dobbs and like 3 other creatives, there is going to be more and more and more work to be done to push back against that. And I think, there's also a lot of opportunity to think creatively about how we want to push courts in New York State and push the legislation in New York State to really increase rights and increase access for people. And in 2024, an Equal Rights Amendment will be on the ballot in New York, which is really exciting because we will have an amendment when and if it is successful that protects people on the basis of their gender identity, sexual orientation, gender expression, and on the basis of their reproductive health and autonomy, sex. So that's really exciting. There are so many opportunities in New York to push the envelope here, even if other states are continuing to criminalize abortion access, criminalize gender affirming care, all of those things.
Wow, that sounds really good. I hope it passes. I have one final question for you. Do you have any advice for law students and lawyers beginning their public interest careers?
Definitely. Do as much as you can while in law school to get outside of your doctrinal classes and engage with community members, whether that is in clinics or externships or anything else that your law school might offer. It is really important to step away from the studying and get real practical experience doing the work that you want to do as a public interest lawyer. I am somebody who had a hard time in law school. I was thinking that my career was going to be over before it started because I got a C in my civil procedure class. And I remember feeling like that was the worst thing that could have happened. And I felt really discouraged. And then my 2L year comes and I am in our reproductive justice clinic and getting to do work on issues relating to a whole range of reproductive justice issues, including access to housing for people who had experienced domestic violence, and research on a whole range of things. And that clinic opened up the pathway for me to be at the organization where I am now, because one of those projects that I worked on was collaborating with the NYCLU, which led to an internship, which led to this fellowship. And thinking back to the start of 1L, or the middle of 1L, when I got that grade, I felt like it was over when it really wasn't. So even if you are somebody who struggles academically in law school, I think being somebody who is able to be a real advocate for clients and for communities is invaluable. And it's not something that can be, it's not something that can be easily replicated. If you are somebody who treats clients with respect and care and honors all of their experiences, that's going to go really far as a public interest attorney, in a way that, you can always learn the federal rules of civil procedure. I am actively learning that right now. But particularly as somebody, if you are somebody who has shared lived experiences with your clients or with whatever population you are serving, you need to hold on to that, because that'll be really special as you are going through your legal career. And I guess the other piece of advice that I'd have for somebody starting their public interest career is to remember to take time for yourself and to lean on your community, both at law school, at your internship, and outside of work or outside of school. Because once you get to the workplace, these jobs are demanding. You're working on really difficult issues all of the time, and you need to take time and find joy in things outside of the workplace, outside of school, so that you are able to rest and be recharged enough to continue doing this work for a long time. I think it's very common for public interest attorneys to burn out quickly because of how heavy the work is, both in impact litigation and in direct services work. And I feel like throughout law school, I didn't take enough time to think about my own boundaries, what I needed to do and what would help fuel me. I feel like I'm okay now being an attorney, and as somebody who wants to do this work for a long time, it's really important that it is actually sustainable.
Thank you for that advice. I will personally keep it in mind, and I hope others do as well. So thank you, Gabriella, for taking the time to speak with me today. It was such a pleasure learning more about what motivated you to become an Equal Justice Works Fellow, and learning more about your career journey following your fellowship. And most importantly, thank you again for your continued commitment to preserving and protecting the LGBTQ+ community and reproductive rights. Thank you.